What's up, guys? Doug Polk here, and today we're going to be taking a look at a hand that was played between Elky and JCarver. That's right, a couple streamers battling it out. Let's roll the clip.
It's a great phrase for so many things.
And honestly, I really enjoy pork chops.
Nice, so it works on multiple levels for you then. See, I don't really like pork chops in real life, but
But in poker,
in poker they're
you
delicious
love pork
and
is your
wonderful.
favorite, is the other
Yeah.
white meat for you.
That's right. I'm more of a turkey kind of guy myself, you know, turkey, chicken, it's
Turkey
350,
chop doesn't have the same ring to it.
No, not quite.
I'm gonna start off playing good, I think, just for at least a few rounds.
Elky's got the deuce 7 this time. And like I said, and I think
I don't really eat fast food though.
People
So good, thank you.
have come to the consensus
Oh, no, I
that
don't need that.
the stakes are so high and the deuce to 7 bounty is so low that
Before we jump into this hand, I do want to say that the players are playing the 7-deuce game. That means if you win a hand with 7-deuce, you get paid an additional bounty from the other players. Anyway, 7-deuce game in effect, and Elky looks down at the 7-deuce from early position. Gotta open it up. Now, obviously the stakes matter a lot. I'm not sure what the exact bounty is in this hand, but I think it's a smaller sized one. But as long as the bounty is somewhat reasonable, you're gonna have to open. You know, your value on taking the pot down just goes up so tremendously that you gotta open 7-deuce in the 7-deuce game. You also likely have to 3-bet 7-deuce, or at least play it in some capacity when you're playing the 7-deuce game as well against an open. Now the question is, how far do you go? And that's actually a pretty good question that we can talk about on some later streets. But for now, Elky decides to open it up with 7-deuce, and the other players start to get out of the way. The action folds around to Jason Somerville in the small blind, and in a 3-blind structure like this, you don't really want to have too many calls in the small blind. We actually talked about this recently in my set over set video, but basically I would advocate to play for a kind of 3-better fold strategy in this position. Ace-3 suited is one of those hands you definitely want to 3-bet. It benefits a lot from taking the hand down pre-flop. You want your opponent to fold hands like King Jack or maybe a hand like deuces. And realistically, post-flop, your hand plays pretty well, but you want to deny that equity of the players behind you in the blinds, as well as some of the equity that the weaker hands that are opening might have. So don't like this decision from Jason. I'd prefer a 3-bet, but he does decide to call. Antonio looks down the straddle and has 9-8 offsuit. Against normal sized raises, this would be an easy call. Against a bigger one like this, it's a little closer. Don't really hate his decision either way, but he does decide to call, and let's take a flop.
the deuce to 7 is only for bragging rights now. People have been burning through their money, losing, trying to win with deuce to 7. And once again, somebody flopped something pretty big here against deuce to 7. Somerville with top and bottom. Elky, of course, puts out a $750 continuation bet.
So why is it so hard to make a pair?
Because there's so many cards, and you only get 2.
It's very difficult.
The flop comes ace-10 tray, and Somerville moves into a comfortable lead here with top and bottom, and no one else even has a card over a 9 or some sort of draw. The action checks around to Elky, and now we get into our first kind of interesting spot with 7-deuce. You have absolutely nothing, bad card removal. You want your opponents to have cards like a deuce or a 7. So should we bet this hand or not? And I think the answer is you do have to mainly bet, because the upside if you get folds is simply too high. You win the pot and then extra money on the side. But sometimes you should take your 7-deuce and check the flop and like to get a little wild on some later streets. Maybe bet the turn when check to, maybe mix in a raise when they bet. You know, try and find some creative lines to put your 7-deuce in. Just because you're playing the 7-deuce game does not mean you have to just raise, bet, bet, bet. I mean, I know that's a good way of going, and you should lean more towards doing that. But, you know, get a little wily sometimes. Get a little trap on the trap pre-flop, trap on the flop, little check back action. Work all these different lines with your 7-deuce, and actually it's a good thing to be aware of when you're in a 7-deuce game that most players are not capable of making that adjustment. So when you're playing the 7-deuce game and someone c-bets the flop, I'd get a little more curious than I might in a normal game. Now, as far as the size that Elky chose to bet, I'm not a huge fan. When he bets this large, a lot of hands have simple flop decisions. If Somerville does have a hand like eights on the flop he can get out of the way. If you pick a small size, you put those hands into difficult situations. You also allow yourself more room to get value with mid to weak aces, possibly a hand like jacks or 10x. So, by betting that small size, you put way more hands into tough situations. Pretty interesting spot here on the flop for Somerville. When he does have top and bottom in a more traditional game, I would certainly lean towards a raise. However, in this game type, trapping gets a little bit more valuable. If someone has 7-deuce, they're pretty likely to fire 3, so there are way more hands that could be bluffing and try and take the pot away from you. Now, I still think you should be raising with top and bottom some of the time, but a little less often when you are playing the 7-deuce game. Antonio makes the prudent decision to get out of the way with the 9 high, and let's take a turn.
Just a call here from Somerville.
That's why they added the deuce 7. So you want
Like
an
it?
extra way to win.
Looks like nice.
I'm comfortable. Thank you.
Did you go ball?
Deuce 7 has
Answer
to be so
you
happy,
go.
like, can you imagine? Because they're like, I never get played in this game.
No.
He always gets pulled, he always goes into the mud.
Well, I love Elky and Somerville battles. These are like 17 degrees deep, Phil, you and I are 1.5 tops. Dan O'Brien goes to about
Elky
5.
has bet
This
here
is an
once
ace king.
again.
That's it. So there's really no level.
1875.
Deuce 7 is thrown into
Oh yeah,
the
so
queens up.
Yeah,
It's like
1.2.
The turn comes an offsuit 6, which is basically as brick of a turn as you can get. Neither player improves, Somerville still way out in the lead, and now Elky drawing dead with just 7 high. Now on the turn, this is a situation where you might want to bluff with a bunch of hands in Elky's shoes. Maybe a hand like King Jack suited, or Queen Jack suited, or some kind of flush draw, or 9-8 suited. But you have to be a little more disciplined when you're playing the 7-deuce game with those hands, because bluffing 7-deuce is simply more profitable. When you bet with 7-deuce and win, you win a larger pot than you would with Queen Jack. So you should absolutely be firing 7-deuce 2 or 3 streets often, and then be checking more of your traditional bluffs. The game actually does change a lot when you add 7-deuce in. You can't use as many semi-bluffs, you can't bluff as many spots post-flop, and you have to really go for that core bluff range of having 7-deuce in your hand. Now, of your 7-deuces, the best ones to bluff 3 streets are probably the ones that don't have a heart. That way your opponent can call twice and fold the river because you don't block any of those flush draws. But that point's not as important here. What hands could Somerville be calling within the small blind that can have a low heart that wouldn't also have top pair? There really aren't many hands that come to mind. Elky does decide to fire the turn, betting 1875, a good healthy bet size on the turn, and I like his size in general. This is a spot where you want to start to ramp things up, get some value if you have a good top pair or better, and give yourself a size where if you are bluffing like with 7-deuce, you get a good situation to try and get him off of his hand in this pot. So I like this bet here from Elky. Now back over to Somerville. If you're not raising the flop, you have to be thinking about calling the turn. Maybe once in a blue moon you could go for a turn raise, but I really don't like that play. I think if you set the trap on the flop, you got to continue to set the trap here on the turn. There are also a couple more hands that have you beat, Ace-6 and 6-6, although neither one of those is too likely. They're both possible, so your hand isn't quite as strong relative to how strong it was on the flop. So ultimately, Somerville does decide to make the call, and let's take a river.
Value own himself, and that's a really bad card here for Somerville. If he was going to try to let Elky value bet ace-king the whole way, because now he loses to any ace.
And instant.
Oh, hey, Maria, you're not allowed to see what hands.
Elky has 7
You're
high.
not allowed to
Okay.
get.
Yeah, we all
I
agree.
wasn't
We
watching
haven't
yesterday,
seen
so
Elky
we're
fire.
tweeting
Yeah,
it
but
when-
3
if
barrels,
you
but
are
if
building
he
in,
does
you gotta
here,
tell us-
Okay.
tell us
this
your
is
hand.
actually going to
No one
work.
can
I
actively
think this is going to work.
Watch or listen to the stream.
Oh, what a terrible run out
Text
here
that says,
for Somerville.
Antonio bluffed you, you gotta tell everybody.
And Elky has bet 4,400,
Not if, and when
and I
when
just
he
don't
wins.
know, unless Somerville is going to soul read Elky, how he's going to call here.
The flop comes an offsuit 10, and Somerville looks like he's hoping to run it up. Now, Somerville does check, and this is where the hand gets a little bit weird as far as what kind of hand Elky is representing he has. He could certainly have aces or ace 10 or pocket 3s. You could maybe have pocket 6s if he bets that on the flop very often. And you can once in a blue moon have pocket 10s. But that's not really too many hands. In fact, if he has ace king or ace queen, you're starting to get into possibly a bit too thin territory. Maybe you think your opponent wouldn't call a 10 on the turn. You could value it with ace king, but even ace queen, ace jack, you might lose to some other aces. So those hands don't make a ton of sense to go for some value. Now, you also have to figure that Jason's going to have an ace a lot of the time. And when he does have an ace, it's now much less likely you have ace-ace or ace-10. So it even knocks out some of your other combos you can have for value. The result of this is that you're going to have to simply be a little more conservative with bluffing. I would say in this spot, you should pretty much never bluff with a hand that isn't 7-deuce. Those hands just don't have the same value to bluff with because they don't win the extra money. So you're only going to bluff with your 7-deuces, but you have 16 combos of 7-deuce pre-flop, and realistically only somewhere in the vicinity of 8 to 12 combos here in the river. So you're going to have to find a bunch of those 7-deuces to give up with. And this is where that turn fact starts to come into play. I think it is better to bluff when you have 7-deuce with no heart, like the hand that Elky has here, rather than those ones that do have a heart. Now, it's a close difference, and there probably aren't too many hands that Somerville can have that have a heart that, you know, he would have removal against if he did have the 7 of hearts, but it's possible. And why not try and block a couple extra hands if you can? I do want to spend one moment talking about blockers because I know a lot of people get really angry about them. They think, you know what, poker shouldn't be about blockers. It should be about reads and like staring the guy down and saying, I don't think you have the balls to throw rock. But you know what, blockers are actually important. They're not as important as maybe some people believe, but they are important. Look, many times in poker, you have a few different hands you could choose to bluff with. And if one's a little bit better, why not use that one? Why not pick the one that does have the better blockers? It's not going to turn a terrible play into an amazing one. It's not going to turn an amazing play into a terrible one if you don't quite have the right blockers to do something. But it does make a subtle, slight difference. If something is a few percent better, you should make that play. You know, poker is won in the margins, and fighting for those small extra edges like picking the right blockers will help your win rate. It's not going to turn you into a crusher from not understanding how to beat microstakes, but it can certainly help you by a bit in some tough spots. Now, after Elky fires 4,400, Somerville's in a really tough spot. You know, this hand is not that strong, but even though every other ace has you outkicked, Elky's probably not going to bet this size on the river with ace king or ace queen for the reasons that we already talked about. So then after that, the question becomes, what are some of the hands he could be betting for value? Ace 10, ace ace, 3-3, and guess what? You block all of those hands. In fact, there's no way Elky would ever be bluffing with a hand that has a 3 or an ace in it, and he would almost always be value betting with those cards. The only exception would be if he has pocket 10s or pocket 6s, and those are both less likely. So Somerville actually has a really excellent candidate to go for a check call here on the river. And I'm not sure exactly how deep they are, but if once in a blue moon you wanted to get jiggy with it and go for the raise, I like that too. But I think with this hand, you have an absolutely mandatory call to make.
Antonio is here now, but earlier
It's just a really, really unfortunate one here, unless Somerville somehow thinks that Elky's missed hearts or has to do 7.
He's gone though, because
Elky hasn't played this.
But that's now it's AOT.
Elky hasn't
Antonio
made a
off to-
triple barrel one time in the entire 2 days that we've seen him play here.
I'm back.
But off and on.
I'm
it's the
back.
same.
You would have liked AOT.
You would have been earning.
You would have liked it.
Did Phil earn? Helmut?
I don't know.
He didn't capitalize off of AOT?
But with yesterday's down, he lost like 13 yesterday.
Oh.
I mean, obviously, I can see the cards. I'm only going by what we've seen from Elky play, how we've seen him play the last couple days, and I just don't know how Somerville can call here.
What?
Top, like,
He did world
peak
class
Helmut
on that.
needles for sure.
He was good today.
Really good.
He was very good.
Really
today.
good.
I knew he was going to come in firing.
And even sicker, it's like, it was a little bit needling for like him to go around the table and take all that, but it was so needling for him to just sit there and not play his hand and make you just wait
4,400,
and stew.
1,100 to call. He gets counterfeit. He flopped top and bottom.
What do you think?
Just check called the turn.
Jason usually gets these right. I see it on Twitch.
There is the deuce 7 game though. That's
Pretty
always,
sure I had the best hand at some point in this, but
yeah. It's always in the back of these guys'
the
mind.
question is about right now, though. Well, I guess. I mean, I can beat the 7-deuce for sure. That I know. That I know.
And that's always the problem. Every time someone says that, though, it's actually never been the case. When someone's been running a big bluff. It's never actually happened where someone's actually been running a big bluff with the deuce 7. This is the first time.
I have also thought it, yeah.
Like, when you have this much ball with 7-deuce, probably not, but sorry, guys. 1 second.
And this is
Take
why
your
it's
time,
such a
Mr.
perfect
Somerville.
spot and why I wouldn't make this call if I was
In and out of
Somerville.
this now
I'll call the
twice.
clock at 11 p.m.
It's 45, right?
Perfect. I love water.
Hey, how long till All Americans here, Phil?
5:30 p.m.
What time is it?
4.
Were we supposed to order it before?
No, when he drives up, you can tell him. Or you can tell one of the runners and then sit in the AC and they will actually bring them
I think
in.
I might order
They
some
could-
food. Who can I order food from?
Thank you.
Elky's probably
oh, man,
had
Elky, it's so tough. So close.
the least bluffing frequency of anyone,
Antonio, so like Wax doesn't
of
have
any of the
an arm.
players
He just,
for both
He's
days.
like trying to get
No.
one or something?
Waxman is, the camp has X amount of RVs.
Okay.
And in those,
And Somerville calls. Wow.
Right, a lot.
I'm
He
curious.
makes the call. And the 7-deuce burns another player.
Right.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Poker Hands. Hope you guys learned a couple of things about the 7-deuce game. I'll see you again soon, and make sure to hit that subscribe button and join the Empire.